In the last episode, I did all of the first fix electrics on the workshop. And in this episode, I'm going to be sharing my top tips for fitting insulation, plasterboarding the ceiling, and showing you my best method for cutting sockets out of the plywood for the walls. Now, the insulation that I'm going to be using on both the ceiling and all of the walls is this. This is Celotex PIR board. It is quite a bit more expensive than some of the other options, especially rock wool. So if you are trying to save a little bit of money and you're not bothered about having slightly less efficient insulation, then you can choose rock wool instead. So firstly, a bit of an oversight that I made was these noggins. I do need to make sure that once the insulation is in, that there is ventilation above, and these noggins are going to prevent that. Now I've got a couple of options. One is I can drill several holes along the top here to encourage that ventilation, or the other, and arguably I think the best way to do this, would be to actually remove as many of these noggins as possible and cut them down on my table saw so there is one clear span of ventilation throughout the entire way. So now you can see that I've got those noggins back up and they do have an air gap above them of about 50 mil. The only ones I couldn't get out were these ones at the end because they are screwed in from an inaccessible side. So in that case, I have just drilled 3 fairly big holes in that area. And you can see this one piece of insulation that I've got up just as an example means that now that that piece of noggin has been cut down, that above it there is just ventilation. So there's absolutely nothing getting in the way of full ventilation above this piece of insulation. Now, the easiest method I have found to actually cut this is by using my track saw. So the steps that I'm going through to actually do this is first marking up the area where I want to cut it. I'll just stab my tape measure in that end as a mark. I'll do the same thing at the other end. I will then position my track on those 2 marks. I'm then going to grab my track saw. I've got it to the deepest it will go, which isn't actually enough to cut all the way through it, but that's okay. And then I'll make this cut. And I nearly forgot to say, you should absolutely have a dust mask on when you're cutting this stuff. This is not the sort of stuff that you want to end up in your lungs. Here's the one I recommend. I'll have in the link in the description below. Then once you've made that initial cut, move the track out of the way. And with a handsaw, just make your way across and finish this off. And then don't throw bits like this away. You never know if you're going to need them. So just keep them to one side for now. If you're not lucky enough to have a track saw, then you can use a piece of wood and just a normal handsaw. And the main aim here is to make sure that this saw stays butted up nicely against this piece of wood. So as you're cutting it, you know that you're going in at a 90-degree angle. You can then take your piece of insulation and tuck it in on one side. And hopefully I've got a nice tight fit here. And you can see that that is now fully flush with all of the joists that surround it. I did also want to show you what I'm doing for the light. So here you can see I've got the cable hanging down for the spotlights. And I've already cut myself the piece that's going to fit in here. So I'm just going to test the fit. And then just going to use a Sharpie just to mark out the area. So I know that I'm 70 mil off this joist here. Is that better? So I'm there. I'll then take this down. Okay, so now I'm outside and this is the mark where I know that that spotlight cable needs to come through. I've got here a very large fit that I'm going to drill through, but as you can tell, it won't drill all the way through. So I'm going to mark that up and then drill. Then I've got another drill with just a 12 mil bit in there, and the aim with this one is I'm drilling all of the way through. There we go. I can then flip it upside down and using that same bit, just like that. I can then punch it and you can see that I've left with this very spherical cake, and I'm not done with this yet. So using just a normal handsaw, I'm going to chop this in half widthways. I'm then going to grab this little cookie I have made and slide it in, foil side up, and slide the cable through. I'm then going to get my piece of insulation and push it in at one end. And then as you push it up, you're sort of feeding that cookie into the hole. And what you should end up with is this cookie piece here, nicely snug in that hole. And it does mean that when the electrician, if he needs more height, he can just push it and it'll move. But it's also going to help quite a lot of the way to actually reducing the heat loss above the light. You can see that I've done that for a few of these now. and I think it looks really neat. Right, the other thing I've done is just notched out a little bit of this insulation up here. So when I put these spotlights in, the little flaps that come with them don't catch on the side. And as you can see, all of the insulation is now in the walls. And I've got to say, it already feels massively cooler. It is 26 degrees outside. And before putting this insulation in, this room was a bit of a sweatbox. So I'm really happy that this is already working. And before I move on to the next step, which is the vapor barrier, I do actually want to make sure I fill in all of the little cracks in between the insulation and those studs with expanding foam. And that's just to make sure that I'm minimizing the airflow around that insulation. And in order to do that, I've got myself quite a few cans of expanding foam. I've also got myself one of these expanding foam reusable guns. And I am just going to screw this on and work my way around all of those little gaps, making sure that every single bit is filled. Then I'm going to wait 24 hours for all of this to go nice and hard and scrape it all off to make sure it is level, so that when I put the plywood on the walls, it's not going to be bowing out at all. What do you reckon, Bella? We're doing good? Yeah? Good girl. We've also gone around with a Sharpie and marked out where every single joist is, just so by the time we've put this vapor-proof barrier up, we will know where all of the studs are. And for the vapor barrier, we're actually going to be using the excess damp-proof membrane that we've got left over for when we did the concrete base. So after about 1 million staples, we finally got that vapor barrier on the ceiling. If I'm honest, I'm not sure how much good this is going to do, given the amount of staple holes that are in it, but we've done it now and I figured that it's not going to do any harm. Chris is just going along the edges and cutting the excess off, leaving a bit of an overlap just so when we put the wall vapor barrier up, it's not got any corners to escape into. And that did take a while. It's quite hard work. I imagine it's because we've used this thicker DPM, whereas you can use the thinner stuff. But because of the width of this workshop, which is 2.8 meters, I didn't want to go and buy the 2.5 meter vapor barrier because then I'd had to have put up 2 layers. Here I am back in the workshop a few days later, and I have now got all of the plasterboard that I'm going to need for the roof. Now, luckily for me, the guys down at Evolution actually sent me this. This is their panel carrier. And what this allows you to do is put it on one of these panels, and then the pressure of actually lifting this handle up is enough to grasp it. So you can lift it and then go on your way. And this was super useful because I did have to move all of these panels by myself. So this meant I could actually do it without risking dropping these and damaging them. And I nearly forgot to say that I'm going to be putting every single one of these screws in with a combi drill today and not an impact driver. And the reason for that is if you use an impact driver, there's a good chance that you will welt it right through the plasterboard and actually damage the paper. I've also made sure to connect this drill bit into the end. And this is specifically for putting plasterboard screws into plaster, and it will just prevent it actually going too far into the plasterboard. The last thing to mention here is I am making sure to use these. These are plasterboard screws. These are 42 millimeters long, which is going to be plenty to hold these 9 millimeter thick plasterboards to the ceiling. And all of the products that I'm mentioning throughout this video can be found on my Amazon page, and you can find the link to that in the description of these videos. I've just measured the length that the first plasterboard sheet is going to need to be. And even though I planned for every single one of these to land on a joist, it hasn't quite worked out that way. So this is going to need just a fraction cutting off it. And to do that, I'm going to use a Stanley knife and a straight edge, score it down the edge and it will just come off. And then I'll also make sure to clean that edge down with one of these. This is called a rasp. So you can see that I've used this rasp on this edge. It just sands it off like a cheese grater. And that makes quite a rough edge with the knife, a really nice smooth edge. So that's ready to put up now. You also do want to make sure that when you do this, you're putting all of your cuts where possible against the edges in the corners and not where the two bits of plasterboard are butted up to each other. And that is just going to make sure that you're maximizing the strength of the factory finished edge instead of a cut edge, which is usually a little bit weaker. So we have just had to take that first board down because it looked like that back wall is bowing out slightly at the top, which means that it's not actually finishing nice and square. And so we're taking a slither off, like a diagonal slither, which should mean that this does actually butt up to all of those edges and that the next board will fit in nicely. Hopefully. So that is one board up. You can see that we've got roughly 5 screws running along every single joist, and that is going to be plenty to hold that up. So we're just going to make our way around and do the other 6 sheets, and then this will be done. The next sheet we've got has got to cut out this back box for the socket that I put in the ceiling. So instead of lifting it up there and sort of marking it out up, we're sort of taking the measurements from here to here and here to here, and then transferring them over to this sheet of plasterboard that's going to go up there, and hopefully that will fit nice, but we will see. And after a lot of consideration, I did decide to put plywood sheets on the wall instead of plasterboard. And that really is just down to the fact that these are going to be a lot stronger. So if I bang anything against the wall, it's going to be fine. You do want to make sure that you put every single bit of plywood on a piece like this. And that's just going to make sure that you've got an expansion gap below it. So when the wood expands, it's not going to break or crack out the screws. So you can see here that now I have cut this piece of plywood down to the gap where it's fitting. It is fairly good the way it's connected to this board, but there is a little bit of a gap at the bottom here. And ideally, I don't want any gaps. Now, I'm not particularly good at scribing things in, but I'm fairly sure what I need to do is take off the thickness of this gap down here from the top, essentially cutting it at a diagonal, and that should mean that it butts up nicely. So I'm going to mark this out and hopefully get it right. Because if I don't, it means doing a lot of work all over again. So I need to take off that line down to nothing. So let's see how this goes. So you can see that scribing that off has reduced that gap to nothing for the majority of it. I mean, there's a slight hairline gap here, but as far as I'm concerned, that's perfect. Just cutting wood in the rain. Now, it may be raining, but I don't mind because 1, I've put a gazebo up so I'm not getting wet, and 2, this next one lands on a full board, so I've only got to make 1 cut.
Slow down, mama, why you talk so mean? Good Lord, Nashville, it ain't what it seems. Got nice clothes, midnight shows, boogie down at the bar.
And to be honest with you, it's not cutting these boards down that's the difficult bit. The bit that is most time consuming has got to be cutting out all of the back boxes for every single socket. But at this point, I have done about 13 of them. So I'm going to show you the best method that I have found for doing this. So the first thing that you want to do once you know that your bit of plywood has been cut to size and fits up nicely is guesstimate where that plug socket is. I know that it is roughly behind this piece of plywood just about here. Then you want to have ready a rubber mallet, an offcut of plywood, and either a piece of chalk or what I'm using here, which is just an offcut of plasterboard. Then carefully leaning forwards, just get your piece of chalk or plasterboard and just mark over all 4 of the edges of that back box. Then you want to slide your piece of plywood back into position Get your rubber mallet and your offcut of wood and give it quite a few hard slaps. Then grab 2 offcuts of insulation. And if you don't have any insulation, just, 2 thick things, and lean your piece of plywood back. Now, it is very hard to pick this up on camera, but I can just about see the indent that has made. So I'm going to now grab a pencil and a ruler and just mark around that area. And I've only got 2 edges, but that should be enough. If I now get a spare back box, just position that on the 2 lines that I've made, then draw around it. So I know that this is the area that I need to cut out with my jigsaw. The other thing that you've got to remember with these back boxes is there is a little bit of metal on all the corners that just stick out slightly. So if you end up cutting it really tight, it's going to catch. So I'd always, on those corners, just go a little bit further than the line. And now I'm going to drill out all 4 corners with a 10mm drill bit. And then I use this jigsaw to cut around the edges, making sure to cut that line clean off. And with that cut out, the last thing I would recommend doing is getting a file like I've got here and just sweeping off all of these edges. And after that, you can test it by just making sure that a back box fits, fairly snug, which it does, in there. So let's put it up and see how all that looks.
Here's the one.
Because I want every single screw to be lined up, I've made myself this little guide here, and I've just marked up every 200mm the entire way along. So I've rested this at the bottom. I'm using a laser level to make sure that I'm holding this straight. And with a pencil, I will just go along, put a little dot everywhere that I need to pre-drill. And then using this very fancy drill bit that I love, by the way, I'll have a link in the description for those that are interested in getting one of these. I'm just going to pre-drill every single hole. And you will notice I've got a screw going every way down. I've just skipped the one that was in line with the power sockets. And that's just to make sure I don't go through a cable. Not that I think I would, because I don't think the screws are long enough, but it's better to be safe than sorry. After spending a couple more days putting plywood sheets up on those walls and painting the ceiling, I can finally say that the workshop is pretty much totally done at this point. I am still waiting for the electrician to turn up to finish things like the lights and put the fuse box in, just to make sure all the power will work. And there are other things that I will do. But for the most part, I am totally satisfied with how this workshop is currently looking. And although I am of the belief that a workshop is never truly finished, it's one of those things that will go on and evolve over my entire woodworking journey, I am going to say, for the sake of this series, that this marks the end point. Now, there are a bunch of videos that I want to make on the workshop moving forwards. Probably the next one I'm going to focus on is a video summarizing the cost, and you can watch that video by clicking here next. Until next time, happy building.